You can open up your Bibles to Luke 9, 37 to 45, and we're talking about spiritual failure and how to deal with that. And if you have been Christian long enough, a day even, you understand that the Christian life is filled with failure. And if you do not understand what I'm talking about, I hope that through this you understand that Christianity is not for those who are good enough. It is for those who understand very well their brokenness, how they fall short, but yet how God's grace is so sweet. You know, failure, it's a very quotable topic. The best quotes are about failure, and I'd like to just read a few of them. Henry Ford says this: "The only real mistake is the one from which we learn nothing." Oh, that's good, right? Now, I'm not preaching yet. This is just worldly wisdom, right? The Bible's better. But he says, the one mistake is to learn nothing. Malcolm Forbes says this: "A failure is success if we learn from it." Oh, that's good, right? Failure is success if we learn from it. My favorite is this, by a man named Michael Jordan, because I can identify, not because I'm great at basketball, but because of this quote. I saw it, I heard it in a commercial, probably like in high school, thinking, oh, this is my life quote right here. "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career." Really? "I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed." Yeah, the GOAT, MJ. These quotes are inspirational, are they not? It's like, oh, that's right. I need to learn from my mistakes. Similarly, the Christian life, you have to learn from your mistakes. But I believe in the Christian life, failure has a totally different role. I think we can do our best without a biblical worldview to do the best that we can in the midst of failure. But I actually believe as a Christian, the failures that you encounter, the failures that you struggle through, actually are God ordained and actually have a purpose and intention. It's not just learning from. There's something that God is doing in that failure. So in Luke, the passage that we'll be reading, we're continuing Luke. We started it the very first Sunday we launched this church. And every year, every semester for a year, every semester of a year, we go back into Luke, and we'll probably be finished in 4 or 5 more years. But as we learn through this, the idea is to have clarity on what we believe. Luke, in the beginning, he shares that he is not an eyewitness. He was not a disciple of Christ. He was a physician, but he writes to this man Theophilus an orderly account. That's his goal. He wants to write an orderly account, one that is clear, and so that he says this, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. And that's the goal. For you to have certainty, clarity, conviction about what you believe and why you believe. And so scholars and commentators will say of Luke, it is very well written, very well organized. Even the grammar and the vocabulary in the Greek is of one who has been educated, which is Luke the physician. And so Luke 9:37. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. And behold, a man from the crowd cried out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. And behold, a spirit seizes him. And he suddenly cries out and convulses him, so that he foams at the mouth, and shatters him, and will hardly leave him. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon threw him to the ground and convulsed him. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And all were astonished at the majesty of God. But while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. Gospel City, this is the word for you when you struggle, when you fail, when you know you're not living obediently to God. There are all our man-made ways in which how we often deal with failure. But this passage will instruct us in how to deal with it in God's way, not in the world's way, not in the wise way, in God's way. It starts off, but in verse 37, by saying, on the next day, meaning we have to understand what happened the day before. The day before was a transfiguration. John, Peter, witnessed Jesus, this man, self-proclaimed prophet, the Son of God, and in that moment they see him transfigured. And it's immediately right after this literal mountaintop experience, it's after that they fall hard. They fail hard. And they hear hard words from Jesus. And that's Christianity. Sunday, great. Oh, so encouraged by my small group yesterday. Feels so great. Now I'm ready to conquer life, to love that one person, to call my mom and just honor her. You call your mom, and the next thing you know, you're arguing. You're like, oh, failed again. The disciple has more to grow. That's the first point. The disciple has more to grow. Tell your neighbor you have more to grow. You have more to grow. You have more to grow. And the longer you are as a Christian, that truth is so real. My story, I don't remember a day where Jesus was not real to me. I struggled, I doubted, investigated. This past 3 months has been the most interesting of recent memory, because all these doubts, all these struggles are coming that I thought I have conquered. And it's in this I realized, even as I was preparing this sermon, man, God knows. And he speaks, and he is real. And even in my failing as a pastor, I realized, oh, this is the gospel. For the disciples, this was a lesson that they were learning. In their minds, they were thinking, okay, to be a disciple, to be like all the other disciples, we have to memorize everything, know everything, and obey everything. And so every time they failed, I wonder what was going on in them internally. Probably similar to how we deal with things internally. And not only did the transfiguration just happen, look at Luke 9, verse 1. In the very beginning of this, Jesus sends out the 12 for what? It says, gave them power and authority over all demons to cure diseases. So literally, just a few maybe days ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago, they were given the authority. God gives them the authority. They go out to teach, to share the gospel, to preach the gospel, to cast out demons, right? So, having power over the spiritual, having power over disease. They experience a transfiguration and they fall. For some reason, they might be praying the same prayers and doing the same thing, but for whatever reason, this demon won't leave this boy. They're probably confused. My guess is when Jesus comes, like, oh, he'll teach us. But what does he say? His response to them is very straightforward. It says, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." You know, the words that describe this scene, even before that, the parent is desperate, right? He begs. That word beg is repeated. The parent is desperate. The condition is serious. The demon seizes him. There's these outbursts, maybe of pain, maybe of just demonic possession. The word shatters. It says it shatters him. In English, it doesn't necessarily make sense. In the Greek, it's saying that he was beaten and bruised. It's the idea of being completely broken. And imagine, you as a parent, you see this child going through this, and you see these disciples trying to do something. How hopeless would you be? But for some reason, the parent is still able to trust. And it's in this, Jesus is still faithful. Despite people's faithlessness, he's still faithful. Right? He still heals. He still hears the prayer of this man. What that means is you have spiritual mentors who will fail you, but Jesus does not fail. Pastors, teachers do not equate God. I will fail you. You will cacao me and I may not respond, right? It's in that Jesus hears your prayers, okay? I may not, but... And it's in this you start to realize these words here that Jesus speaks, though it seems harsh, it is definitely hard. But please know, it's so insightful. Because basically these two words of being faithless, twisted generation is a reason that we fail every time spiritually. I want you to realize he doesn't say the words, "Oh, you powerless generation." Because if it was about healing specifically, he could have said, "Oh, you disciple, you just don't get it. Why don't you have power?" Right? It'd be the equivalent of learn better, do better, practice harder. Doesn't say that. He doesn't say, "Oh, what a powerless generation." He doesn't say, "Oh, what an unloving generation." Because they tried. He's saying faithless and twisted. What does that mean? What are they guilty of? Twisted, faithless. Faith is your relationship with God. He's saying very clearly, you don't really know me yet. Like, you know me, but you don't really know me. And what he wants the disciples to focus on is not performance, not doing better. He wants them to focus on faith, this walk with God. Because right after this, he says, let these words sink in. And it's repeated, this idea that Jesus is teaching, but they're not hearing. And that's probably your struggle. It's not that you don't know. You know, but you don't know in your heart. It's not heart knowledge yet. So he's saying you're faithless. So don't just study. You have to know, let it sink in. It's faithless and it's twisted. The idea is corruption, unable to walk straight. It's basically like a drunkard. They try to walk with the best effort, but they're completely wasted. And so they think they're walking straight, but you see the real video, right? And they're all over the place. It's like that. It's crooked. We think we're doing okay. God, look at me. I did great this past week. But in HD video and God's TV, it's like a YouTube video, right? They're just walking all over the place. That's the idea. You're twisted. You can't walk straight, even though you think you're walking straight. Faith is our relationship with God, seeing Him, knowing Him. Twistedness is the corruption of our hearts, and it's interconnected. You cannot untwist yourself, right? You're like a pretzel, right? You're twisted, a little bit salty, burnt, right? That's what you are. That's what the picture is. You cannot untwist yourself. You are born twisted. If you try to untwist yourself, it hurts, right? You're like that pretzel. And so what he's saying is you have to fail redemptively. You have to learn to fail redemptively. So tell your neighbor you have to learn to fail redemptively. What does that mean? For us, for an average person, we think of failure, we think of success and failure as success or failure, right? That's usually how we think of it. We get an A, and if you have strict Korean parents, you get an A-. Success, failure, right? It's like the idea that one is good, one is bad. But maybe you heard Jordan or Forbes or whoever, and you heard this quote about using the failure. And so you're like, oh no, it's not success or failure. You're wiser now. So it's success because of failure. Like, oh, that's good, right? You want to be successful because of your failure. You shot 9,000 times, or whatever the quote was, and then you learn to finally make the basket. That's wrong. Don't write that down. Because it's the world's idea. This is what Jesus would say. It's success through failure. Success through failure. Christianity has a completely different view on our spiritual failings. I think in many ways, God allows it. I think in many ways, God allows it for a reason. It's not simply learning from that failure. It's actually through that failure, God has other intentions. Abraham's life is, I think, the most clear. But also many men and women in Scripture, you see this story. Abraham is known as a man of great faith, right? We think of him as a man of great faith. He was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, the one he loves, the only son. It says repeated throughout his story, the only son. He loves this child. In chapter 22, there's a story of Abraham finally giving up his child, but just in the passage before, he finally has him. This is in this scope of Abraham's story. This is all recent. And right after Genesis 22, you know what happens to Abraham? He dies. It's the end of it. It's the end of Abraham's story. And we think of Abraham as this man of great faith. But that is not the story of Abraham. He was faithful, but he failed often. And you know this story, and I've mentioned this many times. He leaves, right, in Genesis 12, this land, this home. So that's the first obedience. His life is, he starts with obedience, he ends with obedience. You know when sports players, they say, we just want the last game to be the game that we win, meaning that you basically win in the championship. The idea is similar in Christianity. You'll start faithfully, you accept the Lord, you believe in Him. You'll fall a lot. But the end journey should be that you're still successful in that you're faithful in that sense. And so for Abraham, he follows, he obeys. But then what does he do? He lies. But it's not just lying, right? There's lying like my dog ate my homework. There's that lying. And then there's this lying of other kings are checking out your wife and they want her. And so for you, because you're scared that these kings may take your life, you say this lie, oh, she's not my wife, she's my sister. Have her. All right, there's two different lies, right? One is my dog ate my homework. The other is giving up your wife. That happens twice. In that, God speaks to Abraham, saying, "Through you, I'll bless nations through you." You'll promise a son, and then what does he do? Because he can't have a son with his wife Sarah, he has a child with his maidservant, taking his God's plan into his own hands. That's his life. But notice he doesn't stop in his failure. He doesn't stop in his failure. And I believe in Genesis 22, the reason he's able to wake up early the next morning, travel for 3 days, and then offer his son up for a sacrifice, it's not because he's been good all this time, especially because despite him being good, he sees God's grace and faithfulness. And so at this point, when he sees Jesus, hears this call, he's able to obey. Why? Because now he has faith. Rock solid faith. You see, your failures are allowed by God because you need to know not just that He is holy. Most people know He is holy. There's all these laws and rules that represent who He is and what is right. Most of us, we know that. But when we fail, what do? We don't go to God. We're ridden with guilt and shame. And what God allows is for us in our failure to know not just that He is holy, He is gracious. And once you know that He is gracious, that's when your life has faith. That's when your faith has life. You see, Abraham, he was not successful because he didn't fail. He wasn't successful because, despite his failures, he was successful in his failures, or even through his failures, because failure is the window to God's grace. And you have to understand that. If you don't, your tendency will always be to do, for example, if you want to read the Word and you don't, you start to feel guilty. What happens? It compounds. It's a snowball effect, and you have this battle with it. Now, the idea is, in that failure, that's a reason to go to God. Not because you're good enough, but because of that failure. You see, you learn to mature in faith when you learn to fail in grace. You will not grow until you fail in grace. You learn to mature in faith when you learn to fail in grace. There's this old worship song. It's like a country song almost, because you know how country songs, it's like a story, right? It's like, it talks about when I was 3 years old. Right? It has a story. This is the country, like a country-ish worship song. But actually, one of my favorite songs that, I grew up with. And it talks about this idea that life is good, life is fine. But all of a sudden, something happens, and you realize, oh, I need to grow. Just a time, I think I'm at peace with the world that's mine. I feel at ease, I feel at home, and I know I'm not alone. Then in my rest, there comes a test that shakes me till again I know that what I've had is not enough, and again I've got to grow. The longer you are a believer, the more those words ring true. That you're doing okay. You feel like finally I've got it. Finally I figured it out. Finally I've overcome this sin. And then something happens. You fall flat on your face. And you wonder, what is wrong with me? It's in that. I believe God even allows that. So that you would realize again, you are a Christian not because you are good. You are a Christian because despite that, in your failure, that you would know how sweet God's goodness is. The disciples here are being taught very important lessons. Jesus has been teaching, this is what's going to happen to me, but they're not hearing. And it's in this failure, I think their ears are opened up again. But the reality is right after this, they fail again, and right after this, they fail again. And Jesus allows it so that they would finally learn these lessons. So in verse 43, Jesus is always teaching. He's always teaching. The question is, are we listening? Are we learning? He's always teaching. So in verse 43, but while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus takes a moment, right? Jesus said to his disciples, it's a teaching moment, right? If you're a parent, you know what this is. Everything happens, and that thing that you're trying to teach your child, they get it. And so you teach them. You seize that moment. So he's seizing that moment. They couldn't heal. Jesus heals. Everyone wows. They marvel. The disciples are humbled. And then he says this, the teaching moment. Let these words sink in to your ears. It's not that we don't know. We know here, it's not here. And the prayer for all of us should be, God, let these words sink in my heart, let it sink in. These words, let these words sink in. It's literally laying down a foundation. It's the idea that as the builders would build, they would lay down this foundation. So in Luke 6:48, it's that same word. He is like a man building a house. He dug it deep, laid down the foundation, laid the foundation on the rock. Let these words sink in. 1 Corinthians 12:28. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers. Right? As God sets the church up, it's that same word, let these words be a foundation, let these people be a foundation. The teaching of the apostles, the prophecy of the prophets, the teaching of the teachers, let it be a foundation. And the same idea for you. It's not that you don't know. Let it be a foundation for your faith, for your life. What Jesus is specifically saying is you think you're wise. You think you know a lot. We all think we know a lot. We all have a lot of intuition, a lot of opinions, right? The proof of that is YouTube comment section, right? Everyone has an opinion. But the reality, what Jesus is getting at is you don't know. You have more to grow. And that's when the hunger is ignited, right? That's why athletes love being the underdog, because they need that competitive fire. Spiritually, it's the same idea. If you think you're all good and all that, the next thing you know, you're going to fall hard. But God allows us to fall hard because we all think, we're all that, right? All the time. And so we fail, we struggle. And so even in that transfiguration, the words, the very words of God to the disciples, to Jesus, it was this. A voice came out from the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." It's the words of God that help us understand his grace. You can try to understand it conceptually, but I don't think the way that we grow is simply spewing out theology to our minds. I think it's actually being in the presence of God, letting the Spirit of God and the Word of God minister to our souls. So you learn to be mature in faith when you learn in grace by living in grace. If you are not living in grace, if you don't know his presence, if it's not sweet to you, theology is only theology. But the Spirit of God takes the Word of God, that theology, and something happens in your heart. And when that happens, that's when life change happens. That's when confession happens. And this should happen regularly. It shouldn't be once at a retreat, right? It should be regularly. I think the older you get, I think the more regularly this happens. Your outward actions may look great. It should be better than before. But the mature believer knows the heart. And they know the struggles. They realize how much they fall short. So even though their actions seem okay, in their hearts there's this war with sin. And it's in that they realize how important God's grace is. You have to live in grace. If you do not live in grace, when you fail, you will run away from grace. So you have to live in grace. A disciple has more to grow. Tell your neighbor you have more to grow. You have more to grow, and now you have more to do. A disciple has more to do. These words from verse 44, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. That's what Jesus is saying to his disciples, verse 45. They did not understand this saying. It was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about this saying. Jesus is teaching them over and over and over the importance of the cross, how he needs to be betrayed, denied, crucified, how that's a part of his will. They could not conceptually get it. But the moment that you do, that's when Jesus comes alive. You have faith. But he says this not just to show them that the important role. He also tells them because time's ticking. That's why he's frustrated. He doesn't have all day with them. So there's this frustration. Disciples, one, you have to understand who I am, what I have done. Two, you have to understand I am leaving. If you do not understand I am leaving, you will think you have all day and you will take your time. For us, what does that mean? Jesus is coming back. You don't have all day. Either he will come back or you will pass. But time's ticking. And that's what he wants the disciples to understand. It's like the kid who plays a sport and practices, but never sees the game, so therefore he only practices, but his practicing is less enthusiastic, there's less motivation. But once he enters into the game, he realizes, oh, this is why. This is one of the reasons God puts us into ministry. This is why pastors are the first to say that we are sinners. Because in this ministry, you have to give and give and give, and in your giving and giving and giving, you realize, oh, my heart, it's not very loving and generous, and then you realize all this sin. In your small groups, same idea. If you join a small group, some days will be great. Other days you'll walk out like, whoa, what was that? Like that person sinned, oh, that guy's a sinner, right? And then people will gossip. But it's in that you realize you're committed. You don't understand that person's sin in terms of why they do it because you don't struggle with it. But in that you humble yourself, you love each other, and something magical happens. There is more to do, more people to love. This man or this parent was broken, desperate, begging. Even as the child comes, the demon throws him to the ground. Even in that moment, it was a spectacle for everyone to see. And the message is people are broken. Jesus is leaving. So disciples wake up. And same message for you. People are broken. Jesus is coming back. Wake up. There are people all around you who are broken, who are hurting. In Matthew's account and Mark's account of this, it's actually a little bit more clear in terms of what this condition was. The child had epilepsy. So it's a physical condition and a spiritual condition. But Luke, the physician, doesn't mention that. And I find that fascinating. You know why he wouldn't mention it? In my mind, the only reason to mention it is to emphasize the spiritual. To let people know, yes, financial issues are real issues. Relational issues are real issues. Addictions are real issues. But you could solve every addiction. You could solve every family relational problem. You could solve every financial problem. If you don't solve the heart spiritual problem, they will always suffer. And this is the idea that there's more to do on a spiritual level. The best part of this whole story is this. The disciples' lack of faith does not hinder Jesus' ministry. That's hope. Because you've all experienced broken churches, broken pastors, broken preachers, broken missionaries. You've experienced it all. You realize you're broken as well. And one of the reasons you don't want to go out into the world and be more bold is because you feel like you might break something on a spiritual level. If I share my faith and they see me then partying the next day, then, well, they're going to know this. God knows your brokenness. He knows you will fail. He knows you will be hypocritical in some ways. But God is in control. And so even in this passage, it shows even in the disciples learning. They didn't understand it, but in verse 45, it was concealed to them. God is in control. Go out and be light, be love, and don't let fear hinder you. If you fail, you fail. Let the Lord still minister despite you. Jesus leaving the transfiguration, that mountain. I find it just very blessing. He could have stayed up there and just waited for the cross to come to him, but he doesn't. He leaves glory to enter into a spiritually tormented world. And he does that for you. He does that for you every day. He goes out to you. He leaves the place of glory, enters into your broken world. And so if you start to think, well, God, you know my sin, and you start to really struggle with that, and therefore you start to leave times of God because you feel like you're being hypocritical, you're not keeping your word, know that even though you can't go to God, sometimes God goes to you. The question is, are you allowing God to speak? Let the words sink in deeply. At the end, it says they feared, so they didn't ask. If you're in a small group, if you have questions and you want to ask that question, but you're scared what the other people might say, like, you don't know the answer to that, I'm going to ask you, ask it anyways. Because you need to face those fears so you can actually get to those questions that you need to hear and through it grow. Don't let fear be a reason you don't grow here at this church, in your small group, definitely with the Lord. Whatever struggles you have, no matter how wicked you think it is, don't let that fear hinder your approaching of God. I'm going to quote these words that we just sang, Christ is mine forevermore. It's a theme of the retreat. It's a song that has ministered deeply to me. Let me read it. But mine is hope in my Redeemer. Though I fall, his love is sure, for Christ has paid for every failing. I am his forevermore. And the best part of the song is not when we wallow in our struggle or sin or pain. The best part is the rejoicing. Come rejoice now, O my soul, for his love is my reward. Fear is gone, and hope is sure. Christ is mine forevermore. As you grow in faith, you realize your emotions will go up and down, up and down, up and down. And the longer I'm a Christian, the songs I appreciate more are the ones that are just robust in theology, just all about Jesus. And this song, it's not like a Hillsong song, right? It's not one with guitar and this bridge. It's like but it's a song that is filled with truth. And my hope and prayer is that it's going to be one of your songs. Hard times. You could go to a song, hear it, let the Lord minister to you, that he is yours forevermore, whatever you go through. Let's pray.